Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Gameable Saturday Morning D20.
Today in the cave, I'm going to flash back to childhood for a little bit. We have one of the hosts of Gameable Saturday Morning, Kris Newton. Kris is a freelance game designer in Northern California. Along with his wife, Katrina, Gameable Saturday Morning analyzes movies and animated series and mines them for role-playing game story arcs, character development, and ideas. I was introduced to them through one of our listeners actually telling me about their deep dive into Batman the Animated Series, which was excellent. And as we speak, they are dedicating an entire month to Gargoyles. And so far, it's been fantastic. Kris, thanks so much for joining us in the cave.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you've not seen, read, or played all the material and are spoiler wary, consider this your warning. And with all that out of the way, let's dive in. So, Kris, you and I actually haven't met. As opposed to some of the guests that I've had on the show, I have some, personal or professional familiarity with. So this is going to be fun for me. Also, childhood Saturday Morning is burned into my memory as a personality developing part of my history. So I'm super excited about this. But so I touched on a few of these things in the intro, but can you tell us more about yourself? Tell us about what you do.
Sure. Well, the thing that I guess you know me from, and that most people would know me from, is Gameable Saturday Morning, which is part of the Gameable series of podcasts. We actually started as Gameable Disney, thinking that, we'll never get through all these movies we want to talk about. And then we did. We got through basically the entire animated Disney canon, plus all kinds of miscellaneous stuff. We talked about the Herbie movies. We talked about Mary Poppins.
Oh, God, what? I don't know if I can go back and listen to the Herbie movies. I loved those as a kid, though. Man, I love those movies.
I think nostalgia helps with the Herbie movies, but I had never seen them. And so when I went back to them for the first time, I found that, you've got the Love Bug, and then you've got Herbie Rides Again, which is a little better, and it really is all downhill from there. Herbie Goes Bananas is barely a film. That is my 3-word review. But we've gone through everything from the worst that Disney has to offer, all the way to fantastic stuff like Batman the Animated Series, the Lion King, the Toy Story movies. So it's been a pretty wide range, and in all of them, we're either looking for what do we love about this, and can we bring to the gaming table, or what didn't work here from a storytelling perspective, and how can we maybe avoid this, because we've all had gaming disasters as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And see, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you guys on the show as well. So, regular listeners know that we have a segment in our regular review episodes called the Canary Debrief. And in the Canary Debrief, I break down what we can learn about storytelling in general for the show, but for whatever creative endeavor you are involved in. But of course, Caleb and I are pretty heavily buried in the RPG industry, so gaming story arcs definitely come up. So to find out that there was an entire podcast dedicated to basically what we do in the Canary Debrief, I was very excited about. And so as you've covered all of Disney, but then you started to branch out, right?
Yeah, we did. We covered all of Disney. We went on to Pixar, covered all of Pixar. And then from there, we went to Saturday morning cartoons, which is what we're doing now. So that's where we're doing mainly Saturday morning, but also other TV cartoons. So we've done Inuyasha, for example. We've done, as you mentioned, we're in the middle of a Gargoyles series. Geez, what else? Something like He-Man. We did Gravity Falls. So it really, animation is such a huge medium. It's much bigger than it used to be, and much
for sure,
sort of broader. So it's been really great to look at a wide variety of different stories.
So where do you get your suggestions? Because Saturday mornings, man, there was a lot of stuff when I was a kid. Yeah. So what do you focus on? How do you choose an episode, or do you go off suggestions from listeners? Do you have guests on that ask to talk about a certain thing? How do you run the podcast that way?
It's mostly the latter. Throughout Disney and Pixar coverage, it was just me and my wife, Katrina. We would talk. And I think, once we had guests, Peter and Grant from the amazing Saving the Game podcast, but mostly it was just us. On Gameable Saturday Morning, we typically have a guest, and the guest suggests the series. So we've got a wonderfully giant backlog of guests who've wanted to do different series, and we're just kind of slowly working our way through them. So we've for example, we've almost finished our set of Smash Fiction hosts from another great podcast, Smash Fiction. And so we've talked about like the Godzilla cartoon. Liz was just on our last Gargoyles episode. We've had Miles Schneiderman was the one who we had on to talk about Inuyasha. So we've got great guests who are passionate in one way or another about the cartoons we're talking about, which helps a lot because fundamentally, the first thing is you have to care. Like, even if you hate the cartoon, you have to care about it enough to either want to emulate it or avert it. And as long as we've got that from a guest, then I think we can find something constructive to talk about.
You know, it's really funny when I made that statement about how broad the material you could pull from for Saturday morning cartoons. The actual cartoon that popped into my head was the Godzilla Saturday morning cartoon. I don't know why that cartoon is burned into my memory. I'm not even convinced it had more than one season. Was it?
It was quite short. The 70s Godzilla cartoon, and it was an example of where so sometimes we talk about like what made it to screen a lot.
Yeah.
In other cases, a lot of what we talk about is what happened behind the scenes, because very often cartoons are under creative constraints that parallel what we deal with in gaming, because they're making adaptation choices, as for example in Young Justice, right? Like,
oh, interesting.
It's a wonderful success story of adaptation, of taking all this material and really converting it seamlessly to a new format with different challenges. In Godzilla, what you've got is basically a mandate like, okay, make a Godzilla cartoon, but it has to be pitifully cheap. You can't use the distinctive appearance or sound effects of a Godzilla cartoon. He can't stomp through cities and break stuff, and he can't be dangerous. Oh, and he needs to have a funny sidekick. So
yeah, because all I remember is this one scene where I think whoever the humans are in the show were on a boat, and I think it was a young kid like pressed a button on a device that like summoned Godzilla like immediately, as if Godzilla's like following them around under their boat and can be summoned within 2 seconds of pressing the button.
Yes.
That's really the only distinct memory I have of that. Well,
the
show.
episode you're thinking of is all of them. That is...
Maybe that's why it's burned into my memory. They were just recycling the animation.
Yep, it's just people, and see that again. That comes from mandate. That's like, it's Godzilla, but he can't stomp through a city. So what are we going to do in this cartoon? Well, he follows around people on a boat so that he can rise up without putting people in danger and help them out of whatever trouble they're in.
That's hilarious. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on from Godzilla the cartoon.
Yes, please.
So when did you first see Young Justice? Did you see it when it was originally airing, or were you part of the Netflix kind of rewatch group?
Well, I was part of the Whelmed generation that was introduced to Young Justice by your podcast.
No way, really?
Yeah.
So that's amazing.
What happened is actually maybe a couple of years back, I had an ex who was into Young Justice and was like, "Oh, you should watch this thing." And so I did, and I watched the first couple of episodes, which I think you can't appreciate without retrospect from later in the series. I mean, they're good, but you don't realize how good they are until later. And so I watched a couple and I was like, oh yeah, but I've got a lot of cartoons to watch. I do this podcast. So I never returned to it until you contacted me about the show. And so I thought, well, I mean, I'm going to be on Whelmed, so I better do my homework. So since then, I've watched all of Young Justice, some of the episodes multiple times, and binged on your podcast. It's fantastic. It's definitely something I'm excited about talking about on our show, especially now that I feel like I can get your blessing for that, because we'd considered doing Young Justice, right? We hadn't seen it, but we knew that it had a following and considered doing it for the show. But I also knew there was a Young Justice podcast, so I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of redundant. But if you say it's okay, then if you let us operate in your jurisdiction, we can do it.
Okay, first of all, that's a first of any of our guests. So I think we have had guests on the show that watched Young Justice after I had talked about it on social media, but not after the podcast had started, which is fantastic. But also, yeah, of course, the more talking about Young Justice, the better. And in particular, though we do talk about role-playing game aspects on the show from time to time, we're really trying to make the show, from a creative standpoint, accessible to people from a wide range of creative endeavors. I don't care what your creative thing is, what your shtick is. If you love Young Justice or any show in particular, there are things you can learn from that. to either to improve what you do, either by, like you say, avoiding the pitfalls, analyzing why don't I like this thing, or finding out exactly why you like a thing and how that works, and trying to maybe not to at least emulate it, not outright steal it. So to have a full episode where I can just be let off the hook on role-playing game stuff, I will be all over.
Yeah.
So yeah. I want to hear that, if not be on it. Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you're invited. Yeah, we sometimes on the show we use the phrase gamer goggles. That when you're a gamer, when you consume media, often you look at it through that lens, and you're always looking for who are the player characters here, and how would this plot work? And I do think that it's one of the many paths that you can go down to get to this sort of creative approach to the media that you love, which is something I've always sort of liked about the hardcore of traditional geek culture, which is I love this thing. So rather than, sitting back and eating Cheetos on the sofa and just ooh, I love it, give me more. It's that, but it's also let me make a creative response to this. And so whether it's gaming or anything else, I think whatever your medium is, making that creative response to the things you love, it makes you a better creator, and it enriches the media environment rather than just sort of mooching off of it.
Yeah. My friend Lou Anders, who's the author of the Thrones and Bones series, amazing guy. I was listening to an interview with him, and he was talking about a conversation he had with his son about the idea of saying, yes, playing video games is great. We all love to play video games. But how about approaching it from the perspective of a producer of material and not just a consumer of material, right? If you really love a thing, be a part of the thing, right? We have that opportunity these days. And that was part of the inspiration behind our podcast, period, was just that idea. Particularly, I have two young kids, and that concept is important to me for them so that they're participating actively as opposed to just passively. But also in reflection of what you were just saying, I have to tell you, I'm watching an endless amount of Paw Patrol and Miles from Tomorrow and Little Einsteins and all of this stuff. And I'm watching when you're watching the better shows, all three of those are really quite good. When you're watching those shows, it's really difficult for me just to watch the show without thinking oh, how can I adapt this into a no thank you evil game for the kids when they get old enough?
Yeah.
How are they making an antagonist here that's not a bully or violent? How are they managing to pull this off? The character of Mayor Humdinger, who's a mayor from a different town than Adventure Bay, which was where Paw Patrol takes place. He's actually a pretty great villain or antagonist. He's got some of the cliches, he's got a really long twirly mustache, but he's blonde instead of dark haired, and the little things like that. But how they make him make poor decisions and be an opponent, and then how the Paw Patrol deals with him in these non-violent, obviously, ways of diffusing conflict. Where's the Mulligan? Where's the MacGuffin in this episode? What are they trying to do? How is this lay out in a role-playing game standpoint so that I can hopefully draw the kids into the story because I know they already like whatever's happening on the screen, but, make it easier for me to create the stories for them.
Yeah, and I think you're right on in thinking that that's important for kids and for everyone who's being formed by stories, which is, of course, all of us. There are things implicit in stories about, how we resolve conflict and what makes a situation function. This is something that really occurred to me as I was watching Young Justice in preparation for the podcast and thinking about it in gaming terms, is that so much of what defines fiction is the because. It's what separates it from just a list of events. This happens because this happened. And the nature of that because in the story is so powerful, and it seeps into your subconscious. So on a show like Young Justice, for example, there's such an emphasis on the because being about relationships and group dynamics. Things are so much more often because of who we are together and what this group is and what it sort of how this family grows. That's a totally different way to look at life than certain, superhero stories where it's this one heroic man walking this lonely road and everything is because of who he is.
Right, absolutely. Well, so to back it up just a little bit, what was your experience with DC comics in general, or comics in general, really, before you watched Young Justice? I mean, clearly you're into Saturday morning cartoons, but I know people who watch cartoons or animated series that actually have never picked up a comic.
Yeah, well, I had the benefit of a strange religious upbringing, and so I was not allowed to own a television during much of my childhood, and so comic books were the next best thing. So I had
Nice.
a big kind of motley comic book collection. I was never one to really subscribe to comics or have like the pull list, but I would always like raid the quarter bin at the local comic book store. So I have this weird patchy knowledge. Like there's whole chunks of like people talk about different Batman stories and like I don't know what they're talking about. But I definitely read all his Who's Who entries, so I know that stuff because nobody wants to keep Who's Who, so that's in the quarter bin. And for example, if you've got some questions about like Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew or something of that nature, All-Star Squadron, then I can jump in and give you some information on that. So yeah, it's
I'm a big Captain Carrot fan myself, so it's all good.
Rodney Rabbit. I think now originally he was Roger Rabbit, but they had to do like the author saving throw and change it to Rodney Rabbit. But it was still like our Rodney Rabbit, right? Now that we've had all these reboots, it may just be Rodney Rabbit. So I've not gotten the memo on the latest continuity revision of Zoo Crew.
Oh yeah, where's Zoo Crew Rebirth? I would be all over that, I think. I'm trying to remember. What were the characters? There was Rubber Duck, Pig Iron.
Mm-hmm.
There was the Wonder Woman Poodle character.
Yankee Poodle,
thank you. Oh god, it hurts.
Alter ego Rova Barkett, yes.
Now I honestly want to dive into this a little bit. Oh, who is the turtle was the speedster. What was his name? Fastback? Something like that.
Timmy Joe Terrapin.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is something that I kind of want to dive into a little bit. Zoo Crew, Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew, it was actually a pretty good comic back in the day. Mm-hmm. My memory of it was actually pretty good. It didn't take itself too seriously, but it also didn't mock itself too heavily. And it's an unusual kind of group, but there's a lot of things that you could draw from something like that. And I think also from, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, being the expert in the room here, Saturday morning cartoons that sometimes, are able to walk that line between being fun, but also having things to say, having something to say. And if you're excited about it and you're passionate about whatever that happens to be, there's got to be something in there that you can pull out for inspiration for your storytelling. Yeah?
Yes. I am a big fan of like really shaggy, kind of voluminous, throwing everything at the wall. Like that's why I'm a Jack Kirby fan, because one of the things to me that defines Jack Kirby's work, and I know you guys have talked about it on the podcast in reference to like the Fourth World stuff from DC, but also with his of course his seminal work in Marvel Comics. Here's a guy who was doing what it was in many ways hack work. I mean, I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean, this guy was turning out so much art and story at a breakneck speed.
So much material. Yeah.
Not all of it was great, but a lot of it was really good. It came from a deeply felt place, and there was so much of it that almost statistically there was bound to be gold in there, right? Like, I mean, if you get down in any river and start panning at that speed, you're going to strike it rich.
Right.
And we can see the benefit of that in something like Young Justice, where we have all these like amazing, iconic, like powerful, deep takes on characters that naturally, I mean, granted, Greg Weisman has his own special artistic touch. A big part of that is being able to pick up these characters who are formed over decades of trial and error.
Right. And
they eventually, like, whatever was authentic and deep in those characters kind of made it through that public beta of all these characters for so many years. And so, like, you can start with, like, okay, editorial said I had to do a superhero with a purple cape, and I have to turn out, 1 million pages every month. Here I go. Whatever is in you that you care about is going to come out in those stories, and then fans are going to pare it down to something really cool. And that happens with something like He-Man. That was our first Gameable Saturday Morning episode. I mean, that's, talking about hack work, but there's something deep in He-Man. If you go look up the, if you go look up the series Bible, that show is really about, like, it comes from marketing research about how much little boys care about power. So there's something deep in that show.
Yeah, right. Yes. Did you guys do a full deep dive on He-Man?
We did 2 episodes, which is our standard format. And so we talked about,
Okay.
some of the plots and everything. I went and read the series Bible, and so that really informed our setting discussion. So yeah, we did our usual treatment. We didn't do the full like royal 4-episode treatment the way that we're doing for Gargoyles, which is really just to accommodate all the guests who wanted to talk about Gargoyles with us.
Yeah, I would have been all over that as well. I was a little shocked and impressed by when I found out, when I was doing research about Young Justice when it first came out, that Greg Weisman had been involved as well. But one of the things that I find interesting, you've got, I think, 2 of the episodes of your Gargoyles review have aired as of this recording. And in one of them, you do a little sidebar where you're talking about the history of Gargoyles. And I have always associated Greg Weisman with Gargoyles, but it was interesting to me that you dove into it a little bit deeper in talking about how, unlike Young Justice, he doesn't have a lot of credits put on the show. Writing credits, directing credits, producer credits, any of that. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Sure. And I actually appreciate the opportunity to do that because it was actually funny. I was putting the episode together and I have this little aside, like sometimes happens on Gameable Saturday Morning. It's like, okay, we were tracking down the origins of this cartoon. A lot of the testimony comes from one guy who gives himself a lot of credit, so maybe take it with a grain of salt. And, in this case, it happened to be Greg Weisman. And then you tweeted about our show and tagged Greg Weisman. It's like, this sucks. Now he's going to go listen to our podcast and think that we don't trust him. But no, what it was is it's a common situation where the production of these cartoons is really fraught, and it's hard to track down who is sort of the artistic center, like who made what contributions. And in the case of Gargoyles, the show really was Weisman's baby all the way through development. And it seems from his own testimony that he just cared about it so much that once he had finished developing it, he wanted to continue to be involved in production, which is unusual. And so he kind of guided the show, and he built a rich mythology for the show, which is not always the case with Saturday morning cartoons. However, when it comes to what actually made it to screen in terms of credited work, like writing credits, in the 2 seasons of Gargoyles we looked at, Weisman doesn't have one. He didn't write a single episode of the show. Yet, if you look at his kind of canonical pronouncements about the show, fans pretty much accept them uniformly. In fact, they accept them over what actually aired in the 3rd season, because fans, I think, have just adopted Weisman's vision, even though he was not a writer on the show per se, as the defining creative voice in Gargoyles.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's so interesting to me because I haven't gone back to do a heavy rewatch yet. And honestly, we've considered maybe when Whelmed is done, what are we going to do next, if it'll ever be done, now that we have our 3rd season and hopefully beyond. But what else would we do a deep dive on? And Gargoyles has definitely come up. So that's really interesting to me. And Greg's been kind enough to chat with us from time to time, and he'd like to come on the show. Warner Brothers has a lot of the production crew on lockdown for obvious reasons for interviews. But I would really like to dive in on that and maybe get that story out, about how that worked from his perspective.
It's interesting because as I've thought about it, from a gaming angle, I feel like in a weird way, like his role as sort of a producer on Gargoyles and how much creative input he had despite the lack of credited work. It's a little bit similar to what sometimes happens in role-playing, where if you're like a, let's say, designer working on a game, or a writer of modules or something like that, or even a GM working on creating a setting, it's sort of similar in that like you're creating everything but what's on center stage in some ways. Like the writers are creating the words, but the toys they're playing with in their scripts are coming from Weisman. So it's an odd kind of creative role. There's an interesting parallel there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let's get into the gaming part of it just a little bit deeper. Like, so what's your origin story as a gamer? You said you had a unique, or maybe not so unique, I'm not sure, religious upbringing when it came to TV and popular culture.
Yeah, well, I was big into comic books, as I mentioned, and so I was interested in role-playing games, which were at the comic shop in some cases. And so my mom ended up buying me the TSR Marvel Superheroes game, and that was my first role-playing game. I was very young and couldn't make heads or tails of it. It's the game with like the big color-coded chart on the back, and like you've got all these dice you've never seen before in your life, and it was very confusing. So I enjoyed it and loved it, but couldn't really play it. So then we shot a little bit lower and got Toon, and that was cool.
Oh, nice. Toon was a lot of fun, man. I remember very fondly some great games of Toon back in the day.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, if I'm looking back on like what are my sort of formative gaming inputs that feed into what I'm doing now on the podcast, I think a big part of it is like Warner Brothers cartoons are so different from what we normally do in role playing And there were actually some really good insights in Toon about how to make that gameable.
Yeah. And for those of our listeners who don't know, Toon is basically Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the role-playing game. Like, you can take it wherever you want in Warner Brothers, but you kind of get this kind of mishmash, or you can anyway if you want to run it that way, a mishmash of different things of your favorite, cartoons across the ages and bring them together. That's what I remember.
It's I don't know if I'd go exactly to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but definitely it's meant to encompass Warner Brothers cartoons. Probably, I would say Warner Brothers in all of its different iterations. So you can do something that's long form and more like a series, like you can do the continuing adventures of Duck Dodgers if you want, or if like your regular group didn't show up for D&D and so you just want to do a one shot where a cat chases a mouse, then you can do that.
That's fair.
And it's good about supporting all those different things. But yeah, so I did that, and then really it was later on when I got into high school that I sort of like my first like real groups that I played with in a standard role playing way. That was World of Darkness. Like I had a vampire group and everything, and from there went on to playing all the usual stuff. I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons until very late in my gaming career, and then kind of got into all the indie stuff later. Like I created my own game. I played a bunch of Feed. I played Fate. So yeah, I've done a lot of different gaming stuff, and I've been gaming forever. I've been gaming since I was 6 years old, I guess.
So, do you mind if I ask you how old you are?
Sorry?
How old are you? I was just wondering if you mind if I ask how old you are.
Oh, it's fine. I guess I am 33.
33.
You can tell how little I live in the physical world. This is the result of a lifetime of fantasy. I'm like talking about, in TSR, like there was class 1,000, class 3,000, class 5,000. And then you're like, how old are you? And I'm like, let me quick do the math.
That's fair. Well, so the reason why I'm asking is kind of trying to picture what era you kind of grew up in the whole kind of satanic panic. The fact that you didn't watch television, you mentioned a religious background that had some interesting tenets, and then you kind of went from Toon to World of Darkness. Like,
yes,
there's got to be a story in there somewhere. Like, did you say you were in college when you got into World of Darkness, or high school?
I was more in high school. It was, there was a whole process of evolution, and probably my religious evolution played into my gaming, because the satanic panic stuff, like that was a little early for me, but given the company that I was keeping, it was still around. So like, I definitely had figures in my life who were concerned about, like they didn't know enough about role playing specifically to be concerned about it, but definitely there were people who were like dubious about any fiction that involved magic or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was, I think, part of my own personal sort of escape from that very stultifying mindset that allowed me to branch out into kinds of fiction that earlier, I don't know how deep we want to get here, but like I had a copy of Rifts, Palladium's Rifts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That I personally went in and censored to take out the objectionable material. Like it was serious business.
What?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because I came from that religious background that, that had to be done because you had to get that stuff away from you.
Well, Rifts, and again, sorry, because we're talking to potentially people who've never even played a role-playing game before. Rifts was kind of one of the first what I call mashup games, where you could kind of the world itself is being overrun by other dimensions, and so you could be playing, a fantasy type of a character in a science fiction setting, or vice versa. It's a little more complex than that, but you basically had all the genres all at once, all in one place. And it was a pretty fun game. Again, mostly because I think conceptually, I don't know about how it holds up with Palladium's mechanics from the 90s.
Did I mention that I also do a podcast called Mega Dumbcast, where I'm picking out the dumbest thing on every single page of Palladium's Ninjas and Super Spies? The Palladium system outright does not work. So the less said about the system, the better, except for my podcast. Please do listen to that. But Rift was a hot mess when it came to mechanics, but the concept was good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was like something that there was, Rifts really spanned that period where like when I first was introduced to it, I was like, oh, all this has to go because I don't want to corrupt my soul and risk my salvation. And then by a little later in my life, like a few years later, I had kind of grown up. I had grown out of that environment, and I was comfortable with like going and playing Vampire and, dealing with all the stuff that's in that game.
Yeah, because it's certainly not subtle.
Yeah.
World of Darkness material. So let's move on from the gaming thing. So now that we know a little bit more about your gamer and comics background, how did the Gameable Saturday Morning, or I guess Gameable Disney, you said,
Yeah, started with
the
Disney.
first incarnation? Yeah. So first question is kind of like, how did that come about? And second of all, I need to point out that in addition to doing a deep dive on these on cartoons and animated series and movies, for role-playing game stuff, you can also get some fantastic recommendations on breakfast cereal on the podcast. I have been, it has been a fun and interesting part of the podcast. Can you tell us about that and how that started as well? Because I think it's fantastic.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that one person on Earth enjoys our coverage of breakfast cereal.
I love it.
Gameable Disney really started, it was my wife and I, because she is a much bigger Disney fan than I was, I guess I'd say. I mean, now, like, de facto, I am a huge Disney fan. But at the time, when the podcast started, she really knew all those movies and, like, was in love with the songs and all that stuff, knew them from childhood. I didn't, because, again, no television. And so we sort of just got to talking. Like, we were watching some of the early Disney films. We were talking about them. We were talking in gaming terms, as is bound to happen with gamers. And we just thought, what would be cool is to actually sit down and have these discussions on mic that we're having anyway between us about how these stories work and how we would adapt them to gaming. I think a lot of the reason we chose Disney maybe is because we like to start with the most challenging thing. Like, we do a series called Sceptred Isles where we're looking at Shakespeare and adapting that to gaming. And we started with Merchant of Venice and Taming of the Shrew because those are the hardest, right? Like, those are the things most difficult to make palatable. And if you look at early Disney, the characters are so passive in some ways. Like, there's almost a balletic sensibility to something like, Sleeping Beauty. It's really hard to figure out how to make that gameable. And so there was really something to talk about there. So yeah, we just decided to do that, and just decided to do it as long as it continued to be fun, and found that the Disney movies just kind of got more and more interesting to talk about. Even when they went through a rough patch, after that initial kind of golden age, it's a little rough, notoriously, between like Sleeping Beauty and Little Mermaid. There's some real gold in there, but there's also a lot of films that aren't that great. But we found that some of them even were really useful. Like, I mean, if you want to see step-by-step instructions on how to run a bad fantasy campaign, look no further than The Black Cauldron. So in some ways, it was a helpful episode, I feel.
Yeah. Because you can always learn something, whether it's something that you want to emulate or something that you don't. So what was your experience with podcasts beforehand? Do you guys have any audio backgrounds? Like, why did you decide, like, hey, podcast, let's do it? Because it's trust me, I mean, our listeners need to understand that there's a lot that goes into doing a podcast of even a decent level of quality.
Well, we certainly do shoot for decent quality. That's our motto.
Right.
Yeah, we are more of we're a punk rock podcast, and we have the audio quality to prove it. We do not have any sort of formal background in audio stuff, but I certainly was a podcast fan before starting the podcast. There were people like Fear the Boot, actually, another gaming podcast. Mm-hmm. They talked about running a Lion King game at one point, and that was part of the inspiration for the show as well. I've been thinking about how to adapt that and what I would do with a Lion King game. So that was sort of in the back of my mind when my wife wanted to go watch Snow White, and that was part of the formation of the show. Likewise, I mentioned Saving the Game before. That was a podcast we enjoyed. It was a gaming podcast that was quite niche. That's like gaming from a religious point of view. And so that...
Yeah. And he was one of them was your guest on the Batman animated series, right?
Yes. Peter Martin was with us for Batman. And again, our guests choose the series. So his choice of Batman and his insight on it was a big part of why I think that episode was a success.
It was really good, guys. You should go check it out. Sorry,
say again?
I said I was just telling the audience that particular episode is really, really good. You definitely check that out.
Yeah, we and then just a wide variety of other listening to a lot of the same stuff that I'm sure other people have listened to, like a lot of the Earwolf podcasts. Not that those were at all an influence. If you love Comedy Bang Bang, by all means, keep listening to it. I love it too. You will not get Comedy Bang Bang from from Gameable. But yeah, so just a wide variety of podcast listening, and a sense that you can connect to people who are like a niche audience. I think was the big lesson that
Right.
we took from other podcasts that we adapted to Gameable. That like people do love Disney movies, people love gaming. There's an intersection there, and how many gamers are there who really are interested in gaming Snow White? Not a huge number, but enough to support a podcast and have fun connecting to your community. So that was an inspiration.
Yeah, and I think I'm a big fan of the concept of gaming with kids.
Mhm.
And a friend of mine, James August Walls, he is the Living for Crits blog, and he is a huge Cypher System fan. But I got introduced to him because I stumbled across one of his game records where he was gaming with his two little girls. I'm not sure if his son was in that game or not. They're not so little anymore. But it was called Disenchanted Tales, and the girls were all playing. It was Elsa and Merida and Anna were the inspirations behind their characters that they were playing. But they were playing in Numenera, a billion years in the future setting. And one of them had a construct, that was Olaf, and it was actually really cool to watch that adaptation. So that crossover of Disney fan with gamer, at least to me in my experience, is not necessarily a rare occurrence, at least within the gaming industry. So I can absolutely see how your podcast would take off because there's so much material to work with Disney films, positive and negative.
Yes, and we were talking about, kind of sifting and finding the golden things regardless of the overall quality. It's definitely true of Disney because of the mythological roots and the folklore roots of a lot of what Disney treats.
Right.
You can absolutely play with kids and have a great time with, Olaf and Sven and everybody. Or you can go back to the mythology and the folklore that underlies many of these films and do something much deeper and more mature. So there's definitely like on the show, we always try to address both of those sides. We often do talk about gaming with kids, especially if we're talking about something like, Winnie the Pooh, or like we did the Tinkerbell movies.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we also get into like deconstruction or undisneyfication of, how could we really pick up the themes here that you wouldn't address in a kid's movie and play that.
Right. Well, let's give some examples of some of what you do to our listeners. So, can you name or pick a particular movie or animated series or something that you found that was particularly interesting from a role-playing game standpoint, either from character development or plot or story hooks or setting? What jumps out at you in the how many episodes have you guys had? It sounds like you guys have done more than I've realized.
Yeah, we're coming up on episode 150 pretty much. We've done little side things, but yeah, we've done a lot of episodes. Looking back on those for particularly interesting ones, it really depends on what you're looking for. We had a little exchange the other day on Twitter where somebody mentioned that some episodes of the show were too negative for them. And that was interesting to me because that varies from listener to listener. For me, there was actually in that little period of kind of negative coverage that person mentioned, there are some that I look back on very fondly. So, for example, we were talking about the Herbie movies. I did not enjoy those movies very much, but I look back very fondly on that episode because there's a whole implicit world there. And that's some of what I enjoy most about the show is like, so everything is basically alive. Like Herbie can move because he's sort of invested with emotional energy, but everything is potentially alive. Like this weird animistic universe that the Herbie movies take place in. So I love episodes like that. And, He-Man is similar where it's like kind of a boring show, but the setting is really good and could be improved by in gaming, I feel. If you want something that's straight up like we loved this and we talk at length about like how to play this and how to have a great time doing exactly what the show does. You mentioned Batman the Animated Series, also our Gravity Falls coverage, fairly recent. That was a great
this
show.
is the first time I actually heard about Gravity Falls was through your podcast. Actually, I haven't listened to the episode yet, but I saw it, and then once I saw that, I heard some other people mentioning it, and it's actually on. I don't know which streaming service, maybe Hulu, and I haven't checked it out yet because it says that the age range is maybe 7 or 8 years old and higher.
Mm-hmm.
But so my kids aren't really quite old enough to watch that necessarily yet. But it looks interesting to me. It's kind of like a kid's maybe Goosebumps or something like that. Can you dive into that a little bit and what you thought you might be able to pull from that for gaming?
Sure. So it's a show that's heavily influenced by like the X-Files or Twin Peaks, but it's definitely for kids. It has a cartoon sensibility. So I think there's something there for adults to enjoy, but it's nothing too over the top. Like there are some like fairly grotesque special effects. Like 7, I can see, maybe don't go any younger than 7, but it's a really cool show because it has this overarching mystery built up, and it's a really great example of how to pace an ongoing overarching storyline that also includes episodic adventures. That's something that's really relevant to gaming. You know, it sometimes can be difficult to structure your plots in quite that way.
Yeah.
It also is great on we talked about this in the episode with we talked about the character of Mabel, who is one of the two it's a brother-sister team who are sort of exploring the mysteries of this little northwestern town in Gravity Falls. Mabel is great because she's a character who doesn't have a ton going on in terms of like powers or special abilities, but she's definitely central to the story. She's one of the best characters, and you're really able to maintain a focus on like her growing up and like getting friends and everything, even as the show is constantly delving into an overarching plot. And the way that they allow characters and plot to interlock on Gravity Falls, never really letting one obscure the other, is also a huge gaming lesson. And we talk about like how to create your characters and engineer your scenario so that we can keep following something like, oh, you know, this character who was boy crazy is now sort of like maturing a little bit in a different direction, or she was lonely, but now she has friends, and what are their dynamics? That's all allowed to happen without losing momentum on, you know, your big supernatural mystery plot. So tons of great lessons in Gravity Falls and super gameable. It's a great example of a series where either playing those characters or side characters from that show or original characters in the town of Gravity Falls, there's absolutely another campaign there waiting to happen.
That sounds amazing. So do you guys, you said you came to something, you know, like D&D fairly late in your gaming career, but have you guys been able to spread out into different systems? And the reason I'm asking is because I kind of want to, your show, as far as I can tell, is pretty system agnostic, right? You don't really talk about, hey, these are the mechanics of how to do this in a, you know, a Powered by the Apocalypse game or something specific necessarily. You're just talking about general ideas, at least from the episodes I've listened to so far. What's your breadth of kind of gaming experience? What are your favorite games? And when you're doing this analysis, do you think of it in particular systems, or think maybe this system would support this show better than that system?
Yeah, that actually came to us from a listener recommendation early in our run. Somebody mentioned like, oh, you should throw out some systems that we could use for these different things. And so we try to do that at the end of our coverage of each show, is throw out some ideas for what we would use. And I find that while we're not like a specific system podcast, so we're not like a D&D podcast or Powered by the Apocalypse or whatever, we do, when we talk about these different facets of the show, get into a little bit of detail about how we would use rules to adapt the material. So for example, in our Gargoyles coverage, I don't know that this episode has aired as of recording, but I'm sure it's up by the time this episode comes out. When we talked about Gargoyles characters and how one of the issues with adapting them to World of Darkness, which is something that's often been done, you know, there's like a famous fan supplement for Gargoyles to put them in World of Darkness.
I actually did my own hack back in the day. I ran a live-action werewolf game for several years in Orange County here, and I was a Gargoyles fan at the time as well. It's a pretty easy hack.
Yeah.
To put Gargoyles in that world.
Yeah, they fit so well into the world. And one of the things that I got from one of our guests, Angela Kraft from Fandible, she was saying that because she's done this, she's run Gargoyles tabletop. It's difficult because the characters are not differentiated by powers so much within the Gargoyle group. So typically when you have a group of like vampires or werewolves, they all have different kind of quote unquote superpowers, basically. But the Gargoyles don't. So getting that system to recognize the difference among characters is a little bit tricky. Whereas if we were to run Gargoyles in something like Powered by the Apocalypse, now we've got these great playbooks to work with that can they can address either mechanics, but they can also address role in the group, which is a much bigger deal in Gargoyles. So like the fact that Hudson is maybe a little slower than Goliath is not that big a deal, but the fact that he is like the retired leader and Goliath is the active leader, that's a big deal. So we want a system that respects that.
Now you're killing me, because now I want to do a Powered by the Apocalypse Gargoyles, a bunch of playbooks.
I think it would be so much fun. And, you know, actually it was
amazing.
It brought out for me some of the similarities between Gargoyles and Young Justice because of working on, like, preparing for this appearance and then also working on our Gargoyles episodes. Because so much of like the kernel of what's cool and what needs to be represented in role playing between like Young Justice and Gargoyles is that group dynamic. Like if you are
Yeah.
gaming Young Justice, that's not complete until we're really representing and bringing out like how these characters relate to one another. It's in a lot of ways much more important than representing their superpowers. And so I was kind of interested in, like, I know you guys have brought up masks on the show.
Yeah.
That's a good example of kind of going in that more narrative direction of like, how does this character fit into the story and really making their relationship integral to mechanics. That's really a great pull. And it's similar with Gargoyles. Like the physical difference between the characters is insignificant compared to who are we all in this family.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So now that you're watching, like you've just freshly watched Young Justice, both seasons, right?
Yes.
And you haven't done an episode yet, though you and I have been chatting about it. What kind of things might somebody expect from an episode if we sit down and have this chat? What did you pull from it, or ideas that might be unique to Young Justice to apply to a role-playing game tabletop?
Well, let me give you one that comes directly from Whelmed. I was listening to your discussion with Emily Bouzas, I think is her name. Am I pronouncing it right?
Emily Bouza, yeah. She's actually my co-host for season 2.
Yeah.
Which is going to be fantastic.
So I was listening to your discussion with Emily Bouza, and she was talking about the different ship names for YJ fanfic. And
right, yeah.
What occurred to me is, in a show that is so much about relationships and so much about teamwork, like even tactically, it goes even beyond like the soap opera stuff into like when we're in a fight, it's all about who's together in that fight and how they can work together, right? I would love to have like, here's my list of things I can do. Like I'm Robin, so I've got my, explosive that little birdarangs or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. But then I've also got like on the side of my character sheet, Chalant. Here's my list of things I can do with Zatanna. And so every scene, whether that is tactical or whether that is a relationship scene, is full of defining characteristics that define different duos or trios within the group so that we're mechanically reinforcing relationships. What matters most is, again, who we are together. That's an example of like,
ooh, I like that.
We're always thinking this through on the show of like, what is actually important in this? What is interesting in this? And then how can we represent that either mechanically or through like GM or player practices? Similarly, your discussion with Quinn Wilson about like using linguistics to signify status. It's a show where like I love the fact that in Young Justice you often get like the glory shot of the Justice League showing up, like that great low angle, like here come like the gods among men who are so much different from us, like bumbling teenagers in costumes trying to get it right.
Right.
And it's always interesting to see like characters where they fall in that scale, like especially with somebody like Dick, who definitely starts out as, to me at the beginning of Young Justice, Dick is the most experienced of the group, but definitely not ready to be in the Justice League. Like, not even close. Versus Nightwing, who you start to feel almost the only thing keeping him out of being one of those people coming down with the League, which he ultimately kind of does in, one of the episodes. The only thing stopping him from that is kind of his connection to the team, the fact that he is kind of forging his own path. He's definitely, in terms of like his competence, he's right up there with them. I would want to track that motion of status and like,
interesting.
What superheroes do superheroes look up to?
Yeah.
That's something I would want to track in the game just to draw player attention to it. So yeah, that's on the show. Basically, we're going to go through who are the playable characters from this that we can get into, what makes a good character for this series. So like certain people maybe are less interesting to play. We talked about this with Gargoyles, for example, of like, Elisa's great. Like, do we play Xanatos, or is Xanatos definitely antagonist, or what?
Right.
So, for example, like in Young Justice, we'd probably have a discussion of, I know lots of people love Lex Luthor, and I think you're among them. Could you play Lex Luthor? Is that a possibility?
I don't know. My first instinct is no. He'd definitely be an antagonist. Unless you, but though the exception to that is always if you have someone who knows how to play, like someone is so into it, like they're plugged into that person. As of the airing of this episode, likely, I'm assuming, our actual play of Masks, which is Young Justice inspired, will have aired. And we were lucky enough to have players that really understood the characters that they were playing, and that fed so heavily into how great that game was. So if you had someone who just clicks with Lex, maybe, but generally, I would say that's going to be an exception to the rule. He's so well presented in Young Justice in a way that when you have a character who is like that mastermind, who has, 10 steps ahead of everyone else kind of plans, it's a little hard to game that.
Yeah, and we talked about that.
You said you guys talked about that in some ways, the idea of having that mastermind character?
With Xanatos from Gargoyles, it's hard to play the character who's always kind of pulling the strings, but there is a motion of that character from more of an antagonist role to more of a sort of ally of the protagonist role in Gargoyles. Likewise, there are scenes in Young Justice where Lex is at least temporarily working with the group. And so if I'm running a one-shot where, for example, the Reach or Apocalypse is invading, and for whatever reason, Luthor is on the side of the Angels in this case, then I could have a player playing Lex and maybe incorporate something like, because it's always, this is a trope common to Gargoyles and Young Justice, the heroes seem to win, but then you get the scene with the villains where they explain this is what they wanted all along. Yeah. You could have the player who's playing Lex have, the secret objective. This is the evil thing you're also trying to accomplish in addition to the hero's objective.
Right. One of the kind of things that I often do in my tabletop games are finding ways for NPCs to be controlled under certain circumstances by the player characters. And I don't mean okay, you're playing your character plus you're playing Lex, but finding ways in a Powered by the Apocalypse style game, for example, giving the party a move or a couple of moves that are Lex, so that temporarily anyone can activate or have access to if they have a good idea about how Lex would react to a particular situation, or in 5th edition D&D, maybe having a group of, say, I don't know, elven archers or something that's with the party. I'm not going to roll all these dice for these elven archers. I'm going to make them a single unit that anyone in the group could use, say, a bonus action to give an order to the unit, and they would do everything, one die roll, they all, fire arrows into an area, that kind of stuff. And I think that with Lex, I might try to at least play around with going that direction, so you still have that separation of him being an antagonist, but having him as an ally playing a little differently on the mechanics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another fantastic way to do it. And in fact, it's very natural to the superhero setting. Again, this is stuff we talk about on Gameable is emphasis. One of the things that's really cool about DC heroes is that, unlike in Marvel, where they're very heavily concentrated in New York, a lot of DC heroes have their own sort of iconic city and rogues gallery. And one way to play this, if you really wanted to get into deep iconography and play core characters who all have their own comic book histories and cities and everything, is to give the player, again, through something like either Powered by the Apocalypse or something like Fate, via Aspect, give them some level of influence over their own city and rogues gallery. So it could almost be the guy playing Superman also has sort of Lex and Brainiac in his back pocket as things he can bring in to influence the narrative. He's not strictly playing them, but the sort of schemes that they get involved in come from the Superman player who's sort of in charge of that part of the setting and that feel of Metropolis and Superman stories, versus the guy playing Robin who is able to do the same thing with Joker and Gotham and, Montoya and all that stuff. Right. So it's a matter of emphasis. And as always, it's a question of kind of pulling that little slice out of what part of this are we most interested in getting into, and the clash of different threads of DC Comics and their histories, and Gotham versus Metropolis, that kind of world's finest vibe. I would totally play that. It's a little different in emphasis from Young Justice, but there's no reason it couldn't be done. Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I love the idea of having either particular moves or some basic mechanics associated with each hero's city as kind of an extra ability, so that you're in, it's my town. It's my town now. I have these. Now you can role play that, and in some cases, games have mechanics that don't feed into that well. So you might have to do quite a bit of hacking. But I think certain systems, particularly ones that focus on that storytelling aspect, like the Powered by the Apocalypse systems, or say the storytelling dice system from Star Wars, something that has, or Fate. There are things that you can, aspects or moves that you can give the players that, give them that feel of this is my town, and I have this little extra coolness, right? It's
It's a sewer urchin from the old Tick animated series
Yeah.
when he goes, into the sewer and Tick's like, "You're so cool down here," right? But he's totally almost useless on the surface, but under under the streets, man, don't mess with him.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great ways to do that. Actually, what comes to mind for me, let's say you don't have mechanics to support it, but you still want to bring it to the table. You're playing something that's more like a Heroes Unlimited or a Savage Worlds or whatever, like something that doesn't really dig into
Right.
that kind of stuff. Another way to do it would be, since the team gets missions from different people in Justice League, if you wanted to do like a mini campaign where we sort of hit all the iconic locations in DC, we could have different sort of like mission briefings depending on whose city the latest place the clue trail has led us, and let there be a rotating GM where basically after we do our adventure in Metropolis, then we discover like, oh, actually the Riddler is behind this. The next session is GM'd by a guy who is using Batman as the mission briefer and setting up the adventure in Gotham that leads us to the clue that's going to take us to Central City.
That's a really interesting way to do a group game mastering theme. Wow.
And it would be cool because they would all feel different. And it would be really fun to do like a different subset of the team because one person is subbing out to be a GM for a while, and a different sort of like mini genre. So you could do like a Silver Age style wham bam story in Metropolis that goes into like a comic book noir in Gotham, that goes into like comedy hijinks or something, in Central City.
I love that. And that one of the things that I think the general populace now is becoming aware of is that comic book movies that's not a genre, right? Superheroes even specifically, but comics in general are every genre. And they're starting to understand that now with the Marvel movies, that you can have like, your Captain America, Winter Soldier kind of street level espionage stuff, and you can have Guardians of the Galaxy, which is just bonkers off the wall space comedy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Thor, whatever he is, and Hulk, which is like, like science heroes. I don't know. So you can have all those things, and I think it would be really, really cool to have not just a game, but also a TV series where you can have that different feel, right? It's not just, oh, we're in Bloodhaven now. It's Dick's town, right? This is where Nightwing has got his thing. But it's not just that he gets the extra move, but that new game master who loves that pulp, noir kind of feel. It would be so interesting to see someone like, Superman trying to fit into that genre, like that episode of Batman the Animated Series where Bruce is missing and Clark takes over, puts the Batman suit on, and Tim Drake's trying to teach Clark how to be Bruce, which is fantastic.
That kind of stuff is always really fun to me. It's one of the advantages of DC specifically. I think that, like, while the Avengers gives you a little bit of like, world's mightiest heroes, sure, but they all feel of a piece in certain ways. Yeah. Justice League to me feels like what it originally was, which is all these different heroes with their own sensibilities all kind of converging and sort of negotiating like what this is going to be among their different sort of styles and abilities and everything. And that's one of the things I actually really enjoyed about Young Justice, is because it is so in love with the deep continuity of DC. You get all these great appearances from these little like bit characters and also big iconic ones who aren't a perfect fit. And seeing somebody like, let's say, Wally interact with Dr. Fate or, with Kent, like that's just so cool because they are fundamentally different characters in a way that's productive to throw them into a scene together.
Right. And they do such a good job of giving these glimpses of the broader just DC universe and the richness of the history. So I'm now running a little bit of a Masks game. I'm just kind of play testing it a little bit because I haven't run it much to kind of get a feel of how it works. And it takes place in Halcyon City, which is kind of their standard, all superheroes living in one big metropolis kind of a city. And so building a deep, rich history behind your world for your fantasy role-playing game or your science fiction game so that it feels alive and that things happen even outside of the actions of whoever your protagonists happen to be is actually a really hard thing to do at a table. At least I find it to be hard. Probably some other game masters or DMs, that's kind of, their shtick. They're good at that world building richness.
Yeah, I think it is hard. I think that especially because something like Young Justice has an advantage because these characters are all recognizable, right? Like basically to invoke the world of the Hawks, all you got to do is draw them, and you've got all this other work that's been done before. Coming up with that, particularly from scratch at a gaming table, can be really difficult, and it varies. Like, what effect are you going for exactly? I think you're right that in almost all cases, it's important for the world to feel alive, and so you don't want it to be like, I think oftentimes as people who do think deeply about story construction, it's easy to get locked into a world that starts to feel very small because everything is so elegantly constructed to tell one story. And it's important, again, going back to like that shagginess that we love about Kirby, to throw in little like bits and bobs, like things that don't particularly go anywhere, but it's just like, oh, hey, this exists. If you guys ever decide to go back to it, there's this whole other thing happening here. And and again, that's something Young Justice, as you mentioned, is wonderful about. Like, I would love to see the Captain Marvel Plastic Man team up. And like, they don't even need to do an episode on that for me to sort of have it in my mind, because I know those characters exist in the world of Young Justice, because they are created enough for me to know that if these characters ever go to talk to those guys exist. They have personalities. They have their own little corner of this fictional world. And I think that ability to sketch is like an important GM ability to, like, we're not going to spend all night talking to this guy, but if he can have just enough of a distinctive personality, or if this setting can have just enough of like, oh, this is cool, what's going on here, for us to like hold it in mind, for it to be kind of grabby, then that's always going to be part of our mental landscape of this world, even if we never quite engage it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So wrapping up a little bit here, we touched on it a bit, but is there maybe a couple, 3 episodes of your show of Gameable Saturday Morning that you might recommend to our listeners to start off with? I want to make it clear that though you are focused on role-playing game kind of ideas and concepts, really being as system agnostic as you are, you're really doing a much broader view of storytelling in general. And I think there's a lot to learn about whatever you're doing. If you're writing novels or comics, short stories, whatever you're doing, that you can learn from Gameable Saturday Morning. Is there a couple of episodes you think might be interesting for our listeners outside of, say, Batman the Animated Series?
Sure. And thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yeah, the Gargoyles series that we're doing right now that we've mentioned would be a really good place to start. It's new. It's got a number of different guests, and it's Greg Wiseman. So if you enjoy Young Justice's storytelling, this is going to be right up your alley. And it's a show that we love. I would say also, I mentioned Gravity Falls. If you're interested in the superhero angle and kind of want to branch off from there into what we do, we've covered it on a few occasions. We did an Incredibles episode. We did Big Hero 6. And so those are places where we get into like superhero group dynamics.
Man, I would think the Incredibles is a target-rich environment for a role-playing game.
It is, and it's a great example. I think it hits all the different marks because it's a movie that we really liked. And so there are things we love about it that we pulled out. We also talked, because sometimes we get into theme, right? We can never resist like the film and literary criticism. The siren song sometimes pulls us in, and the message about special people. There was a lot of discussion of Atlas Shrugged in our Incredibles coverage. Let's just put it that way. So we also had things that we struggled with, that we wrestled with in that episode. And then, so I would say any of those, if you kind of are coming to this from, I like superhero stories that are about interesting people and interesting combinations, and I'm interested in hearing like how those stories are told, any of those would be good choices. And the thing to do is to go to gameabledisneypodcast.tumblr.com. You can look up our show on iTunes, but only the last sort of few episodes are in the feed. If you go to the Tumblr, you'll find links to all of our past episodes. You can go all the way back to Snow White. So pick out whatever looks interesting to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Is there, one of our closing questions is, when did you hear about Young Justice Season 3? But since you just started listening or watching the show with us, you didn't have to go through the pain and suffering of knowing that we weren't sure if there was going to be another season.
I live in a beautiful world where there has always been a Season 3 coming.
That's fantastic. I'm jealous. Curse you, sir. But is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I'm still like, I can't wait. I don't know how you guys have done it, because with Darkseid coming and like the whole treatment of Godfrey, which I think was brilliant. I'm, as I mentioned, a big Kirby guy, so like I am so glad that I did not have to wait all this time. I'm so glad that it's almost here. Yeah. Other things to add. I don't think there's anything else I particularly got to get out there. Oh, one thing. When I went through your podcast, I listened to all the regular episodes, and then I listened to some of the discussions. I imagine that some other people did the same thing. There was some great stuff about Disney in your discussion with Crispin Freeman. So if anybody who is interested in my podcast, or perhaps is listening to this episode of Whelmed because of Gameable, because they're Disney fans, you gotta go listen to the Crispin Freeman discussion, because that one is fantastic.
Yeah, Crispin was an absolute joy to have on the show. I just let him talk and then felt my brain exploding every few minutes from the concepts he was sharing. But yeah, he does a bit of a deep dive into some of the Disney princess concepts, which was amazing.
Yeah, I was not like in total agreement about everything, but I think that they bear different approaches, and he definitely touched on some things that I had not considered before, and so I felt enriched by that. So how do you like that? You have me on your podcast, and I plug your podcast on your podcast.
This is the way that I want life to be. Yeah, it's fantastic. So thanks so much for spending some time with us in the cave, Kris. So where can people find you here on Earth Prime? You mentioned the Tumblr. Where else can they find you?
The Tumblr is the main place, gameabledisneypodcast.tumblr.com. If you happen to be a hate fan of Palladium, you can also look up Mega Dumbcast on iTunes and check out that other podcast that I do, the swearier, a more negative podcast. And also on Twitter at Gameable Podcast, you'll get notifications for all the new episodes that come up, as well as a lot of kind of side discussions and our interaction with other podcasts. So if you're looking to sort of like follow us and see what we're interested in, we recently just posted a bunch of we retweeted some old Gargoyles toys that somebody dug out of their collection when they heard our podcast. So
wow,
that's a great place to follow us as well.
Awesome. And thanks to everyone for sharing some time with us as well. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at www.facebook.com/crashingthemode, on Tumblr now, thanks to Emily Buza, at theyjfiles.tumblr.com, and on our website, crashingthemode.com. If you enjoy our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes, checking us out on Google Play or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings really do help others find the show. If you do leave us a rating, please let us know, especially if you're outside the U.S. We have to look a little harder for those. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced, please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. Hashtag Keep Binging YJ on Netflix. Hashtag Buy YJ Comics on Comixology. And get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Buza. Our editor and producer is Neal Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.